On a December morning in 1980, inside a marble mansion in Newport, Rhode Island, one of the wealthiest women in America was found lying unconscious on her bathroom floor. She would never wake up again. For the next 28 years, Martha Sharp Crawford, the world knew her as Sunny, lay in a hospital bed in a persistent vegetative state. She could not speak. She could not move. She could not tell anyone what had actually happened to her in that bathroom. Her husband stood trial for attempted murder, not once. Twice, the first jury found him guilty and sentenced him to 30 years in prison. The second jury, 2 years later, found him completely not guilty. 2 juries, 2 opposite verdicts, the same evidence, the same woman, the same marriage. And to this day, nobody can agree on what the truth actually was. Claus von Bülow inherited $75 million. She married a penniless Austrian prince, then a Danish aristocrat with no fortune of his own. She had 3 children, 2 of whom would spend the rest of their lives utterly convinced their stepfather had tried to murder their mother twice, and 1 daughter who stood beside that same man in court, defending him until the very end. This case became one of the most sensational trials of the 20th century. It inspired an Academy Award-winning film. It produced a phrase that entered the American vocabulary, used for decades afterward to describe anyone in a permanent, unrecoverable coma. Tonight, we are going through every piece of evidence, every contradiction, every accusation, and every reasonable doubt in the case of Claus von Bülow. By the end, you can decide for yourself whether you believe the conviction or the acquittal. This is the story of the heiress who spent 28 years asleep while the world argued over who put her there. But before we go further, if mysteries like this fascinate you, stories about the secrets old money tries to bury, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Every week on Behind the Pearls, we open the locket on a woman history tried to reduce to a single headline. You do not want to miss what is coming. Now, back to Sunny. To understand how Claus von Bülow ended up at the center of one of the most contested murder cases in American history, you first have to understand the strange, sheltered, almost gilded loneliness of how she grew up. She was born Martha Sharp Crawford in 1931 or 1932, depending on the record you consult, in the most literal sense possible, aboard a private railway carriage owned by her father, somewhere between Hot Springs, Virginia, and New York. Because of that, her family nicknamed her Choo Choo as a small child, the nickname that stuck for the rest of her life. Sunny came later, simply because of her naturally warm, cheerful disposition. Her father, George Crawford, was the chairman of Columbia Gas and Electric Company, one of the great American utilities fortunes of the early 20th century. When he died, Sunny was only 3 or 4 years old. She inherited a reported $100 million at that point alone, a figure that would later grow even further through her maternal grandmother's estate, tied to the fortune of the International Shoe Company. Left fatherless before she could properly remember him, Sunny was raised entirely by her mother and her maternal grandmother, 2 formidable, wealthy women who, by every account, dominated every room they entered. The 3 of them spent summers at the family's Greenwich, Connecticut estate, called Tamerlane, and wintered in a grand Fifth Avenue apartment in Manhattan, where a chauffeured Rolls-Royce delivered young Sunny to the exclusive Chapin School each morning. By every account from people who knew her, Sunny grew up surrounded by extraordinary wealth, but also by a particular kind of emotional remoteness, raised more by the idea of family than by the warmth of it. She attended St. Timothy's School, an elite girls' boarding school outside Baltimore, before entering the world of international high society as a young woman. She was, by the testimony of nearly everyone who ever met her, strikingly beautiful and painfully shy. People who knew her in this period often remarked that she resembled Grace Kelly, the same composed, almost untouchable elegance. It is worth pausing here on something easy to miss in a story this dramatic. By every account, including from people who later testified against her own husband, Sunny herself was, before any of this began, a genuinely kind, generous woman. She served actively on volunteer boards in both Newport and New York society, hosted and attended charity fundraisers, and was deeply devoted to her children. By most accounts, a first-rate, attentive mother, despite the extraordinary wealth surrounding her. The popular image of the bored, idle heiress simply does not match how the people who actually knew her, rather than the lawyers who later argued about her in court, chose to describe her. And yet, beneath that warmth, biographers and journalists who covered the case extensively also describe a woman who privately battled real, recurring depression for most of her adult life, episodes serious enough that she was, by some accounts, nearly incapacitated by them at certain points. Whether that depression was simply the product of an unusually isolated childhood, or something with deeper biological roots entirely separate from her circumstances, nobody around her at the time seemed equipped, or perhaps willing, to properly diagnose or treat. In an era when mental health, particularly among wealthy women, was so often quietly dismissed as nerves, or worse, simply ignored entirely, Sunny's private suffering went largely unaddressed for decades, right up until the moment it became impossible to separate from a murder investigation. In 1957, on a vacation to the Schloss Mittersill resort in the Austrian Alps, 24-year-old Sunny Crawford met a 20-year-old tennis instructor giving lessons on the resort's courts. His name was Alfred von Auersperg, and he came from one of the oldest, most distinguished princely families in Austria, a family that had once ruled the Principality of Auersperg outright. But the collapse of the Austrian Empire after the First World War had left the family relatively impoverished. Alfred had a magnificent name and almost no money to go with it. It was, on paper, exactly the kind of match that filled gossip columns of the era. A wealthy American heiress trading a portion of her fortune for an aristocratic European title. They married in 1957. Sunny became, officially, Princess von Auersperg. The couple settled first in Munich, then in the resort town of Kitzbühel, Austria, embracing a glamorous lifestyle that blended high society with the outdoor pursuits Alfred adored, particularly big game hunting and competitive skiing. They had 2 children together, a daughter, Annie Laurie, known to everyone as Alla, born in 1958, and a son, Alexander, born in 1959. But the marriage, by most accounts, suffered from a fundamental mismatch in interests and temperament. Sunny gravitated toward art, opera, and quiet intellectual pursuits. Alfred lived for sport, physical risk, and the outdoors. The gap between them widened steadily over 8 years. In 1965, Sunny and Alfred divorced. At the time of the divorce, Sunny's personal net worth was assessed at over $75 million. In a strange and tragic echo of what would later happen to Sunny herself, Alfred von Auersperg was involved in a severe car accident in Austria in 1983. He never woke up. He lingered in an irreversible coma for 9 years before dying in 1992, just 16 years before Sunny herself would finally pass, having spent almost 3 decades in an unrecoverable coma of her own. 1 year after her divorce from Alfred was finalized, in June 1966, Sonny married for the second time. His name was Claus von Bülow. He had been born Claus Cecil Borberg in Copenhagen, Denmark, in 1926, the son of a Danish playwright who had been controversially accused and later cleared of collaborating with Nazi occupation forces during the Second World War. As a young man, Claus had chosen to abandon his father's surname entirely, adopting instead his mother's family name, Bülow, and eventually adding the aristocratic von to it himself. He trained as a lawyer at Cambridge University in England, then spent years working as a personal assistant to one of the wealthiest, most eccentric oil tycoons in the world, J. Paul Getty. Claus was urbane, witty, sharply dressed, and by every account utterly without significant personal wealth of his own. When he married Sonny von Bülow at the Brick Presbyterian Church in New York City, he was, in the eyes of much of society, doing exactly what Alfred von Auersperg had done a decade earlier, trading a title and a polished European manner for access to one of the largest private fortunes in America. The couple settled into a life of extraordinary material comfort. A 12-room apartment on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, a 23-room oceanfront mansion in Newport, Rhode Island, called Clarendon Court, the same mansion, in a detail that has never stopped feeling eerie to people who know the story, that had been used as a filming location for Alfred Hitchcock's 1956 film High Society. In 1967, Sonny and Claus had a daughter together. They named her Cosima. For a time, from the outside, the marriage looked like exactly what it was designed to look like. Glamorous, comfortable, the kind of life most people could not begin to imagine. Newport itself deserves a moment of its own here, because the setting of this story was never incidental to it. By the late 20th century, Newport, Rhode Island, remained one of the last true strongholds of old American aristocracy, a town built almost entirely around the so-called summer cottages of the Gilded Age, the Vanderbilts, the Astors, the great industrial fortunes of the prior century, each family competing quietly, relentlessly, to outdo the other in scale and grandeur. Clarendon Court itself sat directly among these legendary estates, a 23-room mansion on the famous Bellevue Avenue, its very existence a kind of credential, proof that the von Bülows belonged among Newport's oldest and most secure families. It was a world where appearances were currency every bit as real as money itself, where a locked closet, a whispered affair, or a single missed social obligation could ripple through an entire community within days. When this case finally broke into public view, it did not simply scandalize Newport. For a brief, intense period, it came to define how all of America pictured what wealth, marriage, and betrayal among the very rich actually looked like, up close. But underneath the surface, the same fundamental problem that had ended her first marriage was quietly repeating itself. By the late 1970s, Sonny and Claus von Bülow were, by multiple accounts, sleeping in separate bedrooms. Both of them had begun speaking openly, even with friends and household staff, about the real possibility of divorce. Claus, prosecutors would later argue, had no independent source of significant income of his own. If the marriage ended in divorce, he would walk away with comparatively little. But if Sonny died while they remained married, he stood to inherit a substantial portion of her fortune, an amount prosecutors eventually placed at around $14 million. During this same period, Investigators later established that Claus had become involved in an affair with a former soap opera actress named Alexandra Isles. This detail, when it surfaced, would become one of the most consequential pieces of the entire case. On December 26, 1979, the extended family had gathered at Clarendon Court in Newport for Christmas. That evening, Sunny was found unresponsive and rushed to the hospital, where she slipped into a coma. She recovered. After days of testing, doctors determined the cause was severe hypoglycemia, dangerously low blood sugar, and diagnosed her formally as hypoglycemic. They warned her against overindulging in sweets and against going for long stretches without eating. At the time, no foul play was suspected whatsoever. It was treated by everyone involved as a frightening but purely medical event. In April 1980, only a few months later, Sunny was hospitalized again, this time after appearing incoherent and disoriented in public. Doctors once again confirmed reactive hypoglycemia and once again advised her to control her blood sugar carefully through diet and to avoid alcohol entirely. It was only much later, after everything that followed, that investigators went back and asked an unsettling question about that first December coma. Had it really been an accident? Or had it been a rehearsal? On the evening of December 21st, 1980, the von Bülow family was once again gathered for the Christmas season at Clarendon Court. That evening, Sunny again displayed confusion and a noticeable lack of coordination. Her family, having seen this pattern before and believing it was once again a hypoglycemic episode, simply put her to bed. The next morning, she was discovered unconscious on the marble floor of her bathroom. She was rushed to the hospital. This time, she did not wake up. Doctors determined that she had suffered severe, irreversible brain injury. The clinical symptoms in some ways resembled a drug overdose, but certain laboratory results pointed toward hypoglycemia once again. The medical picture from the very beginning was genuinely ambiguous, and it would remain ambiguous for the rest of the case's history. What was not ambiguous was what happened next inside the family. Sunny's two older children from her first marriage, Alla and Alexander von Auersperg, had grown suspicious of their stepfather for some time. The increased marital tension that fall, combined with two nearly identical medical emergencies within 12 months, struck them as far too convenient. They turned to the family's lawyer, Richard Koo, a former Manhattan prosecutor, who began quietly looking into Claus's private life. It did not take him long to learn about Alexandra Isles, a former soap opera actress, best known to American television audiences for her role on the gothic daytime drama Dark Shadows. Claus, confronted by his own stepchildren in a tense family meeting, had not even tried particularly hard to deny the affair. According to testimony, he told them bluntly that Sunny had lost all interest in intimacy after Cosima's birth, and that she had, in his account, given him permission to look elsewhere. What Koo needed next was harder to get: physical evidence. He financed a private investigation, reportedly spending around $400,000 of the family's own money to dig further. Several attempts to locate anything incriminating in the family's New York apartment failed entirely. Then, in mid-January 1981, Alexander von Auersperg noticed something that immediately struck him as wrong. A closet at Clarendon Court, one that had always, for as long as anyone in the family could remember, been left unlocked, was now firmly, deliberately locked. It was a closet that Claus alone used. Koo's investigator, a former New York police detective named Eddie Lambert, traveled with Alexander back to Newport. Wary of small-town gossip, the two men deliberately drove all the way to Providence to hire a locksmith, rather than risk word spreading through Newport's tightly connected social circles. They offered the locksmith $300 simply to come open one locked closet. Inside, they found a black medical bag, and inside that bag, they found a collection of syringes. According to testimony, one syringe in particular was found to have traces of insulin on its exterior, though, crucially, not on its interior. That single detail, insulin on the outside of the needle, but not the inside, would later become one of the most fiercely contested pieces of forensic evidence in the entire case. Was it the residue of an actual injection, wiped clean after passing through the flesh? Or was it simply a needle that had been dipped into an insulin vial, but never used on a person at all? There was one more detail buried inside the family's own account of that fateful final Christmas. According to testimony, on December 26, 1979, after the first coma, Sunny and her son, Alexander, had retired to the family library and shared a Crawford family Christmas tradition, a couple of glasses of spiked eggnog. Whether that detail mattered to what happened to her blood sugar that night would become one of dozens of small, unresolved threads the case would never fully untangle. Based on the black bag, the syringes, the affair with Alexandra Isles, and the pattern of two nearly identical medical emergencies in 12 months, a Rhode Island grand jury indicted Claus von Bülow in July 1981 on 2 counts of attempted murder. His arraignment alone drew a media circus. Reporters and camera crews from up and down the entire East Coast crowded the Newport courthouse. A European television crew even gave chase to his car as he left, free on $100,000 bail. The trial, held in Newport, Rhode Island, in 1982, became a national sensation almost immediately. Prosecutors built their case around a stark and simple narrative. A man with no fortune of his own, married to one of the wealthiest women in America, carrying on an affair with a woman who had reportedly given him a clear ultimatum, attempting not once, but twice to kill his wife by deliberately inducing fatal hypoglycemia through insulin injection, so that he could inherit her money and marry his mistress. In its 6th week, the trial reached its most anticipated moment, when Alexandra Isles herself took the witness stand. She had been subpoenaed, reluctant, by her own account, not to protect Claus, but to protect her own reputation and her young child from the glare of the case. She testified that she had given Claus several ultimatums to finally leave his wife, and that their relationship had soured in its final months precisely because he kept hesitating. The von Bülow family's longtime maid, Maria Schrahlhammer, gave testimony so visceral that courtroom observers described it as one of the most affecting moments of the entire trial, recounting, through tears, the sounds Sunny had made in her final conscious moments before slipping away. Investigators testified about the locked closet, the black bag, and the syringe bearing traces of insulin. Prosecutors argued that Claus stood to inherit roughly $14 million, including the Newport mansion and the Fifth Avenue apartment, if his wife were to die, while his own stepchildren, by contrast, stood to gain comparatively little from that same outcome, undercutting any suggestion that the children's accusations were financially self-serving. The jury found Claus von Bülow guilty on both counts. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison. For a brief period, the case appeared closed. A wealthy man had tried to murder his wife for her money, and justice, however belated, had been done. It would not stay closed for long. Claus von Bülow, facing 30 years behind bars, hired one of the most formidable legal minds in America to handle his appeal, Harvard Law School professor Alan Dershowitz. Dershowitz assembled a team that, in a detail that would later become one of the more remarkable footnotes of American legal history, included two Harvard Law students who went on to extraordinary fame in entirely different fields: future financial commentator Jim Cramer and future New York Attorney General and Governor Eliot Spitzer. Dershowitz's strategy focused intensely on exactly how the key evidence, that black bag and its syringes, had actually been obtained. It emerged that the private investigator hired by Sonny's children had worked with a locksmith to gain access to the locked closet, and that the precise sequence of events, whether the locksmith was even present when the closet was actually opened and the bag retrieved, had been described inconsistently by the witnesses involved across different retellings. Dershowitz argued that this evidence had been obtained improperly, in ways that violated von Bülow's basic legal protections, and that the trial court had wrongly forced disclosure of confidential attorney notes that should never have been made public in the first place. There was a particularly strange wrinkle buried in the locksmith story that Dershowitz's team seized on. According to the original accounts given by the three men involved, the locksmith had been paid and had already left the property before the closet was actually opened. Later, all three men recanted that version, insisting instead that the locksmith had still been present when the bag was discovered. That kind of shifting, inconsistent testimony about a piece of evidence this central to the entire prosecution, was exactly the sort of opening a skilled appellate lawyer needed. In 1984, the Rhode Island Supreme Court agreed with Dershowitz's broader argument. Both convictions from the first trial were reversed entirely, on the grounds that justice for the accused had to override attorney-client privilege in this specific instance, meaning the disputed notes and the manner of the evidence's discovery should never have been used against him in the way that they were. Claus von Bülow would face a second trial, and this time his defense was prepared to attack not the evidence collection alone, but the entire medical and psychological portrait of Sonny von Bülow herself. The second trial, held in Providence, Rhode Island, in 1985, was televised, one of the very first major American criminal trials to be broadcast live to the public. Dershowitz himself later remarked that it served, in many ways, as a direct preview of the kind of media-saturated trial that would define the O.J. Simpson case a decade later. This time, the defense called 8 separate medical experts, all university professors, who collectively argued that Sonny's 2 comas had almost certainly not been caused by any insulin injection at all. Instead, they testified, the comas were far more consistent with a combination of orally ingested, not injected, sedatives, alcohol, and her own underlying chronic health conditions. One expert testified about the insulin-contaminated syringe directly, if that needle had actually been used to inject insulin into a person's flesh, he argued. The act of passing cleanly through skin would have wiped any residue from its exterior surface. Insulin on the outside of a needle, but not the inside, he suggested, was far more consistent with a needle that had simply been dipped into a vial and never used on a body at all. The defense also introduced evidence that, 3 weeks before her final, irreversible coma, Sonny had been hospitalized after ingesting at least 73 aspirin tablets, a quantity investigators agreed could only have been self-administered. And then came the testimony that generated the most headlines of the entire second trial. Famed author Truman Capote, along with Joanne Carson, the former wife of television host Johnny Carson, took the stand alongside more than 10 of Sonny's own friends, testifying in detail about what the defense characterized as her extensive, long-standing use of prescription drugs and alcohol. One defense medical witness testified, with almost clinical bluntness, that Sonny had been drinking heavily enough, for long enough, to actually damage her own red blood cells, an argument aimed directly at undercutting the prosecution's theory that insulin, rather than her own years of substance use, explained her condition. The portrait the defense painted was devastating and deeply controversial, not a victim of attempted murder, but a deeply unhappy, depressed woman prone to substance abuse, who may very well have brought about her own tragic collapse. Sonny's own grown children, Alla and Alexander, were furious at this characterization and remained furious about it for the rest of their lives. They insisted, repeatedly and publicly, that their mother had been healthy, happy, and engaged with life right up until the night Claus put her to bed for the final time. Alexandra Isles herself nearly did not testify at the second trial at all. By 1985, she had reportedly gone into hiding in Europe, in part, according to later testimony, because she had received threatening letters from Claus following the first trial. Rhode Island State Police spent an entire holiday weekend tracking her down before she was finally located, flown back from London, and escorted through customs by armed escort to testify a second time. On June 10, 1985, the jury returned its verdict, not guilty, on all charges. In the courtroom, as the verdict was read, Claus von Bülow lowered his head into his clasped hands. Behind him, Andrea Reynolds, the woman who had by then become his companion and constant presence throughout the second trial, burst into tears of visible relief. 10 days after his acquittal, Sonny's two older children filed a $56 million civil lawsuit against Claus von Bülow, seeking to bar him entirely from any claim on their mother's fortune. The case dragged on for 2 more years. In December 1987, it was finally settled out of court. Claus agreed to divorce Sonny formally, despite her being unable, in any legal or medical sense, to participate in or even comprehend that divorce. He agreed to renounce all financial claims to her fortune, by then estimated at between $25 and $40 million. He agreed to leave the United States, and he agreed never again to profit from the case, whether through books, interviews, or any other public account of what had happened. Speaking to students at Harvard Law School the following year, in one of his last extended public reflections on the entire affair before the settlement's silence took full effect, Claus described what had happened to his family in strikingly literary terms. "This was a tragedy," he told the assembled students, "that satisfied all of Aristotle's own definitions of tragedy. Everyone," he said, "is wounded. Some, fatally. There was one final, deeply painful family fracture buried inside all of this. Cosima, Sonny and Claus's only daughter, had stood by her father throughout both trials, believing firmly in his innocence. Her older half-siblings, Alla and Alexander, never forgave her for it. In 1981, Sonny's own mother, Annie Laurie Aitken, disinherited Cosima entirely from her own separate estate, specifically because Cosima had chosen to support Claus. It was only as part of the final 1987 settlement that Cosima's inheritance was eventually restored to her, once she turned 21. A family had been torn apart, not only by what had happened to Sonny, but by what each of her own children chose to believe about why. Throughout all of this, the legal arguments, the televised trial, the dueling expert witnesses, Sonny von Bülow herself remained exactly where she had been since the morning of December 22, 1980. unconscious, unresponsive, and entirely unaware that any of it was happening at all. She was moved to a private, guarded room first in the Harkness Pavilion and later the McKean Pavilion of Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center in New York City. Her family later testified that the cost of maintaining her care during just the first year alone reached $375,000. By the early 1990s, her round-the-clock nursing and room costs had climbed to somewhere between $700,000 and $800,000 annually. She was visited regularly by her children for years. Nurses tended to her day and night. She gave, by every account from those who saw her, absolutely no sign of awareness, of recognition, of any flicker of the woman she had once been. Her two older children channeled their grief and their unresolved fury into something larger than themselves. They founded the Sonny von Bülow National Victim Advocacy Center, which eventually grew into the National Center for Victims of Crime, now based in Washington, D.C., and remains an active advocacy organization today. They also founded the Sonny von Bülow Coma and Head Trauma Research Foundation in New York, dedicated to researching the very condition that had silenced their mother for the rest of her natural life. One detail from this period, when it eventually became public, complicated the simple narrative many people wanted to believe about Claus. Court records that later came to light through an appeals process related to the broader case showed that Claus von Bülow had specifically not wanted Sonny's life support terminated during the years she lay in her coma, contradicting earlier suggestions from her family's camp that he had pushed to end her care. Whether that reflected genuine feeling, ongoing legal caution, or something else entirely is, like nearly everything else in this case, impossible to say with certainty. Year after year, decade after decade, Sonny von Bülow remained exactly the same. The world around her changed entirely. The trial faded from headlines. A film was made. An Academy Award was won for portraying the husband once convicted, then acquitted, of trying to kill her. And through every bit of it, Sonny herself never opened her eyes again. Martha Sonny von Bülow died of cardiopulmonary arrest on December 6, 2008, at the Mary Manning Walsh Nursing Home in New York City. She was 76 years old. She had lived in a persistent vegetative state for 27 years, 11 months, and 15 days, very nearly 28 full years. Her memorial service was held the following month, on January 14, 2009, at the Brick Presbyterian Church in New York, the very same church where she had married Claus von Bülow 42 years earlier. She was buried at St. Mary's Episcopal Churchyard in Portsmouth, Rhode Island. In a small, quietly devastating detail, the name engraved on her gravestone is not Sonny von Bülow at all, but her original birth name, Martha Sharp Crawford. Claus von Bülow, by then 81 years old and living quietly in London, released a statement through Alan Dershowitz upon hearing of her death. Dershowitz called it, in his words, a sad ending to a sad tragedy that some people tried to turn into a crime. It was never a crime, he insisted, even then, even after everything. Sonny's own children, who had spent decades building entire advocacy organizations around their unshakable belief that their mother had been the victim of attempted murder, almost certainly would have used very different words. Claus von Bülow himself lived another 11 years, dying in London in May 2019, at the age of 92, having spent the back half of his long life mostly out of the public eye, by most accounts simply helping to care for his grandchildren. There is one more piece of this story worth knowing, because it reveals just how unresolved the case truly remained, even decades later. In 1990, the film Reversal of Fortune brought the entire saga back into the public eye, with Jeremy Irons winning the Academy Award for Best Actor for his portrayal of Claus, and Glenn Close playing Sunny herself. The film was a critical and commercial success, but Sunny's own children were reportedly furious about it, specifically objecting to the way Glenn Close's performance depicted their mother, in their view as a nagging, pathetic, almost self-destructive figure, rather than the woman they insisted she had actually been. Once again, decades after the trials had ended, the question of who Sunny von Bülow truly was, and who had the right to define her, remained every bit as contested as it had been in that Newport courtroom. So what actually happened inside that Newport mansion in December of 1980? Two separate juries, hearing substantially overlapping evidence, reached opposite conclusions about that exact question, only a few years apart. That alone tells you something important. This was never a case with an obvious, clean answer. Anyone who tells you with total certainty exactly what happened that night is telling you more about their own assumptions than about the actual historical record. What we can say with confidence is this: Sunny von Bülow was a woman who, by virtually every account, struggled for most of her adult life with depression, and increasingly, with the kind of profound isolation that enormous wealth can sometimes manufacture rather than cure. She grew up fatherless, raised by powerful women in beautiful, emotionally distant houses. She married twice, both times to men with grand titles and very little independent fortune of their own, and both marriages eventually collapsed under the weight of fundamental incompatibility. Whether her final collapse was the result of her husband's hand, or the tragic culmination of her own private suffering, or some combination neither prosecution nor defense ever fully captured, is a question the legal system itself was never able to definitively answer. What is not in question is the price that ambiguity exacted. A woman silenced for 28 years, unable to confirm or deny a single allegation made in her name. A family permanently fractured along the fault line of belief versus doubt. A daughter estranged from her own siblings for standing by her father. And a fortune, a name, and a life reduced, in the end, to a single enduring phrase that entered the American language as shorthand for the worst thing that can happen to a person and never end. There is also a quieter injustice buried inside this story, one that rarely gets discussed alongside the courtroom drama. Whichever version of events was actually true, Sunny von Bülow herself never received the thing both sides claimed to want for her. If Claus was guilty, she never saw him held fully, lastingly accountable, and she never received so much as an apology, since the legal settlement that ended the case explicitly silenced him from ever discussing it again. And if Claus was truly innocent, then a woman already struggling privately with depression and addiction was instead transformed, against her will and without her voice, into the most famous coma patient in American history. Her private suffering dissected publicly for years by people who had never once asked her permission. Either way, the one person at the absolute center of the entire case spent every single day of it, and every day for nearly 3 decades afterward, completely unable to speak for herself. Sunny von Bülow's gravestone does not bear the name the world knew her by. It bears the name she was born with, Martha Sharp Crawford, the name of a little girl born on a train, nicknamed for her sunny disposition, who grew up far too wealthy and far too alone, and who spent her final 28 years in a silence so complete that not even 2 criminal trials could ever truly break it. 2 juries disagreed about her husband. Nobody, in the end, ever got to ask her. Her son Alexander once said something that, regardless of which side of this case you ultimately find more convincing, is almost impossible to argue with. Claus von Bülow, he said, succeeded in depriving their mother of a meaningful life, whatever the cause, and was never made to fully answer for it in the eyes of the people who loved her most. That is what Behind the Pearls is for. Every week, we open the locket on a woman history tried to reduce to a single line. We find out what was really inside. If this story moved you, if you believe women like Sunny deserve their full, complicated truth told, subscribe to Behind the Pearls and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. The next pearl is already waiting, and her story is just as extraordinary. I will see you there.